Today about Southeast Asia. So we're going to look at quite a few different countries. So all the way down from Vietnam to Myanmar, all the way down into the Indonesian archipelago. So we'll look at those in here in just a second. Here we go. All right, so Southeast Asia. So the mainland consists of Cambodia, Vietnam, Thailand, Myanmar, and Laos. Myanmar is sometimes referred to as Burma because there's a military dictatorship that controls it, and some countries don't recognize that dictatorship as having real control, and so they had named the country Myanmar, but its old name Burma is still used as well. So you might see it sometimes listed as Burma. And then it also has islands, so Malaysia, which is actually on the mainland too. So you can see this is called the Malay Peninsula right here. And so this is part of Malaysia all the way over into what's called the Indonesian archipelago. But you have so part of Malaysia here, and then you have like Brunei, Singapore, Indonesia, and East Timor are all independent countries on the Indonesian archipelago, is what that's called. Just FYI, archipelago, I believe, was a vocab word before, but that means a chain of islands. Okay, so early civilization. So the early peoples were highly skilled farmers. Rice is going to be their most important crop. So this picture on the top here, this one here, shows a bunch of rice paddies, and that's where they grow the rice. And so they were also skilled in metalwork. So bronze was first cast in Thailand around 3000 BC, and so that was the first time in the world we see bronze, and that will obviously kick off what is going to be known as the Bronze Age. They also worshipped ancestors, animals, and natural spirits. And early on, and then we'll talk more about religion that it develops into later. But kingdoms and empires, there's a lot of different civilizations that developed on seaports. So they became very good mariners or sailors, and they engaged in trade with the Chinese as well as eventually with the Muslims and then the Europeans. So those guys are going to gain a lot of wealth through trade. Mostly this early on, it's just going to be mostly with the Chinese. Okay. So Western colonization. So by the 1500s, Europeans had arrived, and they're going to set up spheres of influence, which we talked about with China. So that's where the mother country, so like Britain or France, they'll control the economic area, but not necessarily political. But later on, they will start to colonize Southeast Asia. So they started off as spheres of influence, and then decided, you know what, we'll just control it politically as well. And so Siam is the only country to not get colonized. So Siam is present day Thailand. So that's this right here. So you can see on here, this is where France controlled. Now, France is actually going to control Vietnam all the way up to the Vietnam War. And that's when they lose that colony, that's when the United States is going to step in. But after World War II, there's going to be a fight for independence. So by 1965, all had gained it. And then some still to this day suffer instability. So, like I've talked about before, in Myanmar, which, like I said, used to be called Burma, that's this right here, they have instituted martial law. So their military governs them, and it's a military dictatorship, and they are harsh to their people. So they control and police using military rules. The Vietnam War, so 1954, the Communist forces defeated the French, and so Vietnam became divided between the North Vietnam, which was communist, and then South Vietnam, which was non communist. So the US is going to step in, and this is through the United Nations that they're going to do this, but they're going to step in and support the South. And this was because we had at the time a policy of containment, which you probably remember from your US history class. But containment basically meant that we were going to contain communism, we didn't want it to spread. Okay, so by 1975, 2 million Vietnamese and tens of thousands of Americans were dead. This was a very, very unpopular war in the United States. So in 1975, we're going to leave. And then eventually the North Vietnamese, are going to come down and they're going to take control of South Vietnam. So Vietnam will become unified under a communist government. Cambodia, they're going to fall to communism as well. So 1975, the communist forces known as the Khmer Rouge are going to come in and take over, and they're going to force people out of cities and onto farms. And during this time, about 1 million people died from starvation, overwork, disease, or execution. Okay, so the communists in Asia, not nice people, as you can see. Colonization and freedom. So the Netherlands claimed most of the islands. So when we're talking about like Indonesia, um, that area there, even part of the Philippines, but we'll get into the Philippines here in a second. So the United Kingdom is going to control Brunei and Singapore, which is on the Indonesian archipelago, and the U.S. eventually is going to control the Philippines. So the Philippines are an interesting story because eventually the Spanish are going to take over, and then for the Dutch, and then in 1898 we're going to fight the Spanish-American War, and so the Philippines is going to be one area that we're going to gain. So we gained the Philippines, we gained Cuba, we gained Puerto Rico, and then a couple other islands in the South Pacific. But what's important about the Philippines is they decided they didn't want to be part of the United States. So the U.S. just let them be free. Okay, there was no fighting. They said, we don't want to be part of you guys. We said, cool. Now, the Europeans, when they do colonize, they're going to bring infrastructure improvements. So they're going to start to replace small farms with large commercial farms. So they're going to start to produce more crops. And then the Southeast Asians worked for the wages. So it wasn't slavery. They worked probably low wages, but they were working for wages. And then eventually, what's going to happen is the Japanese are going to start to build their empire in the early 20th century. So they're going to start to move into Southeast Asia. So we could see this is the Japanese empire at its height. You can see all of this here. This is the area we're talking about today. So they're going to take over. And then after World War II, once we win World War II, we're going to just give all those countries their own independence. In the Philippines. We're going to give them an independence. And then after World War II, the Europeans are going to take over the rest. So we're going to take over this, and the Europeans are going to colonize this area. And because they still controlled a lot of this, or they're taking their colonies back in some cases. But anyway, they're going to take over those areas again, and then eventually fights are going to break out, and that's going to lead to independence. And then eventually, obviously, the Vietnam War is going to happen in Vietnam, and that's going to spread communism around. 1998, Indonesia has moved towards a democracy, and Brunei and Malaysia are constitutional monarchies. So remember, Malaysia is the Malay Peninsula, and then part of the islands on here, part of the archipelago, and then Brunei is on the archipelago as well. Okay, so this right here shows the early colonialism in Southeast Asia, who controlled what. And so you can see this right here is the Philippines. So the U.S. did gain that from Spain, obviously. And then you see the French controlled this, the British controlled this, and then Siam kind of served as kind of a buffer between the two because these two guys did not get along at the time. So that was kind of important for them. Okay. So education. So on the mainland, literacy rates are increasing. So governments are working on improving education, but there's a teacher shortage, and there's a lot of opportunities for American teachers to go over and teach over in countries like Vietnam. That's where Pop's going next year, and then like Cambodia, different countries like that, Laos. You can go over and you can teach, and you don't need to know like Vietnamese. You can teach in English if that's something that some of you guys in the future might want to pursue. On the islands, education and quality of life is increasing. So most children in Indonesia attend primary school. So literacy rates are about 88% in Indonesia and Malaysia, but as high as 93% in the Philippines, Singapore, and Brunei. So getting better. far as language and religion, so there's a lot of different languages and dialects that are spoken in Southeast Asia. There's a lot of different ethnicities in this area. But most of these languages stem from the Sino-Tibetan, so that's like Chinese Tibetan area, and then the Mon Khmer, which is more of like this area right in here. So it's Mongolian slash Khmer. So the Mongolians took over this part here, and that's where we're talking about that comes from. But many speak languages of their colonizers, so a lot of them speak English or French or even Spanish. So there's a lot of different languages in this area. And then nearly all the major religions are practiced in Southeast Asia. Sometimes they even blend religion. So in the islands, Islam is a major religion. So Indonesia actually is the largest Islamic country in the world. And then in the Philippines, the majority of Filipinos are Catholic because they were taken over by the Spanish, as we talked about, and the Spanish are very Catholic. And so they basically forced the people in the Philippines to adopt Catholicism, and then that's what they have practiced ever since. Okay. Leisure and celebration. So in the mainland, they enjoy a variety of leisure activities. So they do things like go to the museums, go to theaters, parks, restaurants, nightclubs. They do a lot of like normal things that we do, that we all wish we could do right now, but we can't because, coronavirus. And then in the rural areas, it's much more about family time and visiting with neighbors and things like that. So seeing people who are close to you. Islands are very, very diverse. So Singapore pop culture is based on modern mass media. So they have taken a lot of their culture from the United States because ours is pretty influential on most of the world. The most popular sport in this area, soccer and badminton, which is pretty interesting. Soccer obviously is popular all over the world, but badminton is, and this is badminton here, badminton is very, very popular in Southeast Asia. Celebrations would include like religious and national holidays. So, for example, they might celebrate Chinese New Year. In Indonesia, they'll celebrate Muhammad's birthday. Those are observed by most people on the islands. Um, so there's kind of a blending there of cultures. All right, that was a quick one today. You guys have a good rest of the day. Enjoy your break. Okay, bye.